So our passage today is found in Judges chapter 8. We will finish with Gideon today. I promise you that. Okay? Gideon chapter 8. We are going to read verses 22 to the end of chapter 8. But I'm going to actually speak all the way through the end of chapter 9. But I don't want to read all of that to you. I'll abbreviate it. Because it really can be condensed really into some small stuff. But it's some big things that happen. And just to let you know, just to give you some information, the book of Judges, as we see, people become progressively worse. The redemptions become progressively not quite as redemptive because people are pulling away further and further and further away from God. And so these stories will continue to get a little bit darker and a little bit darker. So this is just the spoiler alert, forewarning sort of a thing. But if you remember what has happened up until this point in the story of Gideon, Gideon has been called out by God, the mighty man of valor, this man who was full of fear. And God had him pull down a statue of Baal and that worship stuff at his father's house. And people wanted to kill him, and his father said, no, let Baal take care of this. And they said, okay. And so he got his new name, Jerubbaal, right? Let Baal contend with him. And then he had a whole army of 30-some-odd thousand people. And God said you had too many people because if you go in to fight with this many people, you guys are going to say that, hey, Israel, we did a good job. Look at how good we are. And Israel would glorify themselves. Right, so God whittled that army down till he had 300 people. He went in to fight the Midianites, whose numbers were like the grains of the sand of the beach, right? Which really, we find out it's 130,000 men with swords and such. And they kind of obliterate all of them. Right? And so this has been our story so far, and up until this point, we have seen Gideon kind of pointing to God and trying to do God's will. And so we get here into 22 after the Midianites have been completely eradicated from the promised land. They're gone. Gideon has done what he was supposed to do. So here in Judges chapter 8, verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which is a breastplate, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare for Gideon and his family. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again during Gideon's lifetime. The land enjoyed peace 40 years. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon's son of Joash died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They also failed to show kindness to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good things he had done for them. Okay? And so that is what we're going to read today. Let me summarize chapter 9, all right, so that we can get the full scope of what we're looking at today. In chapter 9, Gideon's son Abimelech, that's the son of the concubine, rises up and says, "You know what? I should be in charge. My dad was great. Let me rule these people." And so he convinces one of the towns to supply him with men, and he hires out mercenaries, and he goes and he kills his 70 brothers. All but one. And the one brother that survives puts a curse on Abimelech and the town that assisted him and said, you guys, you're going to end up killing each other, and God's justice will be prevailed. And then the rest of the whole thing is kind of them killing each other. All right? And God's justice prevails. Right? You can't get away with your sin. God does see sin, and he does not like sin, and God is a just God, right? And we'll get into that. So, what I really want us to see first off, though, is right there in verse 22. The Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us. Right? So, they have seen this miracle of the 300 men decimating 133,000 men. And remember, when the 300 men first went into battle, they just took a torch, a jar, and a trumpet, right? They broke the jar, they lit the torch, and they blew the trumpet, and most of the men ended up dying that way. It was such a battle that there is no way on earth that the 300 men could claim that they were the victors, right? That they did this great deed. Yet here we had the Israelites looking at what has happened and said, look at what you did. Look at how wonderful you must be. And this is there to show us the propensity of humanity to assign what God has done to people. To ignore the deeds of God. Right? Didn't God say, look, if you have the 30,000, you're going to surely say that, look at what we did. Well, even with the 300, they said, look at how good we are. Look at how great Gideon is. Gideon, you're a marvel. Amazing. Right? It always puts me in awe when I talk with people who can ignore God's moving in their lives. Right? I am the son of an engineer who's a man of science, and he loves science, right? And all of his friends tend to be scientists, and they all look out at the world and they say, how can you look at all this beauty? How can you look at this marvel? How can you study it as men of science and not see God? Right? As David says, the heavens declare your glory. If you look at the complexity of a tree or a human body, a single cell, and you look at that complexity and you see the design and you go, how can you look at all of this and deny God? Yep, we do it every day. Right, we do it every day. We ignore God. We ignore what he's doing. We ignore his splendor. We go, look at how wonderful this accident is. Because if God didn't design the earth, if God didn't design humanity, we're an accident. We're just happenstance, right? Amazing. I mean, honestly, personally, I think it takes more faith to believe that we are created by chance, that evolution just happened to happen, because so far I have not seen it. A watch out in the wilderness. I've not seen a computer just appear, sort of a thing. Just when I throw things in the air, they don't land down in great structures. No, it's just a pile of junk, right? It takes faith to believe that God didn't make this. But you see, God didn't make all of this. And so we should give God the glory. We should give God the glory. But no, they wanted to give it to Gideon. Because it's much easier to give it to a man. You know what I can do with a man? I can hold a man accountable. I can say to Daniel, Daniel, you did this wrong. And you know what? Daniel can say to me, Dad, what you did yesterday, the pizza you made, I had to make dinner yesterday. The pizza just it didn't measure up, Dad. Right? Dad, your pizza just is not as good as Mom's. You've got to stop making pizza. Let Mom do it. Right? He could hold me accountable for the fact that I put on more cheese than Mom put on. Right? I put on the wrong kind of cheese. Right? Only on one of the pizzas. We can hold, and so we don't want God because we can't hold God accountable. And we'd rather have an accident because you know what? An accident can't make decisions and can't judge us. Right? If it's just nature out there, if all this is happenstance, well, we don't have to worry about justice. Right? We don't have to worry about a just God existing if all this is accident. And if it's just another man, well, well, if it's just another man, guess what? You screw up as much as I screw up, and so, hey, you can't judge me either, right? But when there's a God out there, all of a sudden, no, he is above us. He is greater than us. He does deserve the glory. And so that they ignore the glory of God. And they ask Gideon to rule over them. And this is really the crux of everything. Is we don't want God to be in charge of us. We don't want him to rule over us, because then we'd have to answer to him, right? And that's all what I just went into. We don't want to have to answer to him. And really, sin comes down, and sin boils down really to that. It's saying, God, you have your way, and I have my way, and I'd rather do it my way. You know? God, I know that you said this is right, but I'd rather do this. God, I know you said this is evil, but, I kind of like that. So how can that be evil if I like it? Right? How can that be evil if it makes me feel better? Well, Gideon says to them, look, you don't want me to rule over you, right? God already rules over you. And this really is one of the major stories of Israel. Israel is constantly looking for somebody other than God to lead over them. And God has already given them the law. In the book of Exodus, he initially gives them the law, and that's when they left Egypt. When they left Egypt, Moses goes up Mount Sinai, he gets the 10 Commandments, he comes down, right? Maybe I'm at the wrong mountain. I don't too many mountains. All right. Sorry, right now my mind's on Mount Cadillac in Maine, because we're planning a vacation to Maine, so, right? So, anyway, he comes down, he gives them the law. They have everything they need to follow God at that point, with those 10 Commandments. And they have the law. And, if that's not enough, he breaks it down. And he goes even deeper into, all right, let's get into some specifics. And if you read through Exodus, he has a law for, this is how the priests should perform their duties. He has a law for, all right, if this happens, if a bull kills one of your servants, the guy who owns the bull, he has to pay you this much and you need to kill the bull. Right? If you kill the man's bull, well, then you got to pay the man this much. And everything's kind of parsed out there next to this. Broken down. Right? They have the civil law there. They have a moral law given to them in Exodus. So they already have the law of God. And God is in charge. And the reality is, from that point on, their job is to live it out on their own. And as a community. Right? But there wasn't this hierarchical system outside of the priests and the prophets. Right? And then they ended up bringing the judges to kind of settle disputes. But really, the individuals were responsible and they were answering directly to God. Right? Because the priest's job, what was a priest's job? The priest's job was to talk from the people to God. And the job of a prophet was to talk from God to the people. And God was the one in charge. And he was supposed to be the one in charge this whole time. And all they had to do, all their job was to surrender to God and say, God, I will do what you call me to do. God, I will listen and do and follow these commands. That's the way it was designed. But that wasn't enough for them. They said, no, we need to have some other kind of leadership. We need to have some other kind of rule. Because, well, when we get to Samuel, they give us a reason of, well, all the rest of the world has a king, so we need to have a king. Right? It's like coming in here and saying, well, because America is democratic, we need to be democratic. Well, no, we need to answer to God. Morality is not decided democratically. Morality is decided by God. What is right no matter what the population says. Okay? And so, we are answerable to God. And that's what Gideon tells them. No, I shouldn't rule over you. God should rule over you. Well, the reality is we keep trying to get that rule away from God. That's really what it is. We're trying to get the rule away from God. We're trying to get the rule away from God. And so he says this to them. And they say, well, what can we do? And he says, well, just give me your earrings. Give me one earring from each of your spoils. All right, and that earring he he uses it to create this ephod, this breastplate. The ephod wasn't just a breastplate like something worn out into battle. It was a breastplate really used for worship. Right? It was what the high priest would wear. He would wear an ephod with the gems, 12 gems in it, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And it was meant for worship. And so he has this ephod, and he hangs it up in his hometown. And the Bible says there that Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it. This is in verse 27. They worshipped the ephod. Gideon said no, and so they worshipped the ephod. And it says, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Right? So Gideon recognizes that God should be in charge. That God should be the leader of all of us. That we shouldn't be leading each other, but that it should be God. Right? He recognizes this. He recognizes, hey, God should be getting the glory for the work of the 300. But at some point, he takes the ephod and he kind of lifts it up. And he kind of goes, after a while, it becomes a snare, and he starts to worship the ephod. He starts to worship the deed rather than the doer. Right? He starts worshiping something other than God. And ultimately, that something is himself. Right? It becomes a snare, and he starts worshiping himself to an extent. Right? And it's a snare not just for him, but for his whole family. There is a danger we have in our lives, is that we like to believe we know what's right. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's what the book of Isaiah says. Right? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And it turns out that what's right in our own eyes tends to be wrong. Right? Because, well, I decided this was right regardless of what God says. And so what does Gideon do with this glory that he has now taken for himself? Well, it says he has 70 sons. We were talking about this sometime the last week, and my wife said something about, oh, you know something's going on there. And my sister-in-law said something about, yeah, there's something's going on there. You know there's a sin there, right? Because you don't have 70 sons from one woman, right? You don't have, just not possible. Just at some point, the lady's going to give out. It's just, you can't push that many kids out, right? And so he is taking on multiple wives. We go, well, God's permitted this in the past. Yes, God has permitted this. But he's never said it was good. He's never said it was right. In fact, when Jesus comes along and they ask Jesus about divorce, he says, well, what does it say? You know, God created man and woman. One man, one woman is the idea here. That one man was supposed to marry one woman, and that's the way marriage was supposed to be. Not, you know what, I'm a guy, so I can have 5 wives, right? It's not the intent there. In fact, when we look at marriage, marriage is supposed to be this picture of God, Christ, and his bride, Israel, right? His bride, the church, which is grafted into Israel, right? One bride, not multiple brides, not many brides, but one, right? And so Gideon kind of takes this glory and he starts having multiple wives. And we can tell from back in Judges chapter 6 that Gideon really wasn't all that great of a guy. You know, he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to win multiple wives, win the affections of women. No, he was a scaredy cat who was threshing wheat in a wine press where you can't thresh wheat. You know, he was a weak guy. He was a scared guy. But he used the glory that he got from the deed that God did through him to allow himself to be kind of lifted up. To allow himself to be worshipped. I've read some things that kind of boil sin down to that notion of we all kind of want to be worshipped a little bit. We all want to be praised a little bit. You know, we want people to look at what we've done and say, wow, that's great, you're amazing, you're wonderful. I was having a dream last night that I was preaching, and while I was preaching, the person playing the piano wasn't my mother-in-law. It was actually a music director from another church that I went to. He started playing, and the people started singing, and afterwards everybody clapped. And in my dream, I was excited. They liked my sermon. They thought I was great. That's wonderful. This is amazing. We all kind of want that little bit of worship, right? But the reality is that the worship belongs to God. The glory belongs to God. And this is the sin that we hold on to is, no, we should get a little bit of it. Right? Well, he used me. Yeah, well, he could have used the rock too. And the reality is, let's face it, when we read through Scripture, guess who God uses the most? He uses the fools. He uses the incompetent. He uses the dumb ones. Right? So if God's using you, I don't think I'd brag about that. Right? Guess what? If God's using you, guess what? You're probably the idiot in the room. Right? Well, Gideon kind of takes this worship. He accepts it. He accepts the glory. And then it says he died. And it's one of those things that's very interesting. Throughout Judges, up until this point, we've kind of seen when the people, the judges kind of done what God had called them to do, that the people rejoiced and they praised God and they gave God the glory. We don't see this in the story of Gideon. Right? We don't see this. And so when Gideon dies, we have that story of Abimelech, his son. His sin of desiring that worship is magnified in his son. It is lifted up in his son. To the point of his son says, you know what? Dad should have ruled. And it's interesting, I find it interesting at least, that Abimelech is not just his son, but it's his son of the concubine. Right? It says he has multiple wives and a concubine. A concubine is somebody he's not married to, that he's having physical relations with. Right? And so it is the son of the concubine, so the illegitimate son at that, who says, you know what? Dad should have ruled. I'm going to rule. He lifts himself up. He desires that worship, and he desires it so much that he's willing to kill his brothers for it. He's willing to kill for that. And I just want us to see that this sin didn't start with Abimelech. It probably didn't even start with Gideon. It goes back. And so we get this passage in Deuteronomy, which is Deuteronomy chapter 5, that I have in the bulletin for you guys. This is a repetition of the Ten Commandments. This is the second time that the Israelites are hearing it. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Right? Who brought them out? God did. Not Moses, God. But you know who did they lift up most of the time? Moses. At one point, you know who they lifted up? They made a statue of a golden calf and lifted up this golden calf and said, look, it did this wonderful thing. Right? God brought them out of Egypt, out of bondage. He said, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Right? So he said, look, your sin is going to get passed down to your children. I'm going to deliver your iniquities to them. Right? I'm going to visit these iniquities. I'm going to deal with it in each of them. You know why that is? Because we can jump down to Deuteronomy 24:16. He says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. So it's not that the children are being punished because the fathers did something. It's because the children are being punished because the children are doing what the fathers did. Right? It's because our sin is taught to our children. our sin is picked up by our children. And I want to note, as we look at Abimelech, our sin is magnified by our children. Right? And you could say, well, you're just picking one case out of the whole Bible. Well, let's look at another one, right? Let's go to David. David's a great guy some of the time. But David had a problem with women. Right? We see that with David and Bathsheba. Okay, well, what happens because David has a problem with women? Well, a couple of his sons rape one of his daughters, and that causes a civil war amongst them, which is why Absalom ends up being killed, rebels against his dad. Right? We have Solomon, wise King Solomon, who you know what the downfall of Solomon was? Well, he had many wives, and because he had many wives, he took them in and he started worshiping other gods with his many wives. You see, his dad had a problem with women. His sons magnified the problem. Right? So it is not that, hey, my dad did this sin, and so now I have to suffer for it. No, dad did this sin, and I learned to do it more. Let's jump back up to that Deuteronomy chapter 5 passage. I didn't finish it. And I didn't finish it for a reason. So the third and fourth generation, God visits the sin of the father upon the son. Why? Because we want to be worshipped. We want to be lifted up. But it says here in verse 10 of Deuteronomy chapter 5, but he shows mercy to thousands, to those he loves, or those who love me and keep my commandments. You see, the sins of the father are passed down from father to son, from parent to child. Really, because moms, you're not left out. Daughters, you're not left out either. Really, it's parent to child. But the reality is that our faith can also be passed down. If we're intentional about it, if we truly love God, and we demonstrate that to the world around us. We show the world this love that we have for God. But in the end of the day, and this is the hard part, at the end of the day, our children still need to make that choice for themselves. And I know many of us have children, or I don't have children yet who are at that age. Many of our children have decided not to go to church, have decided to walk away from the faith, and it breaks our hearts. But we need to be intentional to show them the love and forgiveness of God, even while they're not going to church. And I would say that you should invite them to church every once in a while, but I would also say that it's probably not a good idea to nag your children to be like, why aren't you going to church? You ought to be in church, Bible, because, they just kind of tune that out too, right? But the gentle reminder occasionally, we were in church and this is what we talked about. Have that conversation with your kids. Or, you know what, I was reading in my Bible the other day and this is what I read. Just that sharing your daily devotion with your kids can help bring them a long way. But the reality is, when we look at the story of Gideon, we find sin so prevalent and passed on. And we find that God is a just God and he punishes sin. And that's something we can't forget. God is a just God. And so, a lot of people, for them, the cross is a stumbling block. But the reality is that the cross is the fulfillment of the justice of God. Right? Because I sinned, you sinned, we have sinned. Somebody has to pay the penalty for that sin. Right? If nobody pays the penalty for that sin, there is no justice, and God is not a just God. And all those things that we've talked about so far, they're kind of obsolete, right? But the reality is that somebody has to pay for that. And so Jesus Christ went to the cross and died on the cross so that the justice of God could be fulfilled. Right? So that all those things that we've talked about today, and from the Psalm and the redemption of God, his forgiveness of Israel, his redemption of Israel, could be fulfilled. While God could remain a just God. The mercy of God could be fulfilled. And here's the thing that I think is wondrous and glorious is that, you know what, my sins may be passed on to my children, but I can teach my children of the forgiveness of God so that they can find redemption from those sins as well. But knowing these things says to me that I need to, A, pay attention to my sin. I need to look for it. I need to seek it out. I need to watch it, and I need to try to put a stop to it. Right? And I can tell you, lately I've been watching one of my children, I will not give you their names, do some things, and it's like, they picked that up from me. I guess I better stop doing that because I don't want my child doing that. And I will make sure. You know, we've got to watch out for those things. Even when our children are grown, they're still watching you. They're still looking at you and how do mom and dad deal with this? And so we watch for our sins. We catch them. We need to learn to forgive ourselves as God has forgiven us. And we need to learn to forgive our children. And we need to help them know that that forgiveness is there. That love is there no matter what. Will you bow with me in prayer?